ground was a wasteland of fire and smoke, trenches and forts already smashed to pieces as if the world itself had been bombed. Lines of spears and banners rose against the burning sky, two armies facing each other with no room left for retreat. Soldiers roared as they charged, swearing by Nebula's name and vowing to bring hegemony down with sheer faith and steel. The two lines smashed together, steel meeting flesh as the fight between gods turned into a brutal struggle between the people under them. Far from the front lines, a player's fingers flew across a glowing blue keyboard, feeding orders into the system faster than any general could shout. Heavy hammers crashed down, rifles spat fire in perfect rows, cannons hurled shells across the field, and blue-robed mages raised shining barriers to catch the storm coming back at them. Nebula's cool blue hand slid across his board, sending planes screaming toward the front, and Hegemony's burning grip answered from the other side, twisting the sky with red power until lightning tore down between them. High above the burning earth, Nebula and Hegemony loomed over a shining chessboard, shifting ghostly pieces while real planes rained fire below, each move pushing their world closer to a final checkmate. Lone warhead tore through the burning sky, its nose glowing as it pushed faster and faster toward the world below. Dozens of warheads roared upward in formation, and high above them Nebula's blue figure floated, calmly guiding every path through the system. On the ground, the enemy commander looked up and froze as blazing trails crossed the sky, the coming strike so bright that even the smoke of battle could not hide it. Hegemonia watched the rising warheads and calmly named the attack for what it was, taunting Nebula as she bragged that she had planned for this exact move. Golden interceptor rockets shot up from her side of the field, forming a bright wall of light that raced to meet Nebula's warheads in the sky. Most of the missiles vanished in the clash of light, but one kept climbing, breaking through the clouds and into the dark above the world. Far from the front, a green-skinned priest knelt in a sunlit hall, raising Hegemonia's horned blade high as he begged his god to crush the enemy's final trick. Rows of worshippers dropped to their knees behind him, hands clasped and heads bowed, and their shared faith surged upward like a tide toward their burning god. The last warhead dropped toward her capital, its glow washing over the tiny streets on the map. In the temple, the green priest held her horned blade high, tears running down his face as he poured every bit of faith into his plea. Hegemonia's burning helm tilted, and she calmly said that in a world like this, praying is never pointless. Far above the clouds, something answered. Teal light coiled through the dark sky, twisting around the climbing warhead like a living rip. The glowing current tightened, wrapping the metal shell in a thick teal grip until the warhead stopped fighting and simply hung there in its grasp. Towering teal giant with Hegemonia's horns rose over the castle, one hand calmly pinching the stolen warhead between its fingers. She made it clear that on this ruined world, faith never just fades into the air. It always turns into something real. Nebula leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the display of her giant form clutching the warhead. He recognized the pattern at once and noted that she was pulling the same faith-fueled defense players once called the Holy Orc strategy. Nebula's gaze hardened as he studied the data, and he quietly decided that Hegemonia had shown her hand too clearly. High above the world, one of Nebula's satellites drifted into position, its panels catching the faint starlight. Since he owned the skies, he could turn the empty space over every army into his personal firing range. Sleek metal rods slipped free and plunged toward the atmosphere, turning into silent spears aimed straight at the battlefield below. As warning images flashed before her, Hegemonia's flaming avatar jerked around, finally realizing that the real threat was falling from the endless space above her followers' heads. Hegemonia cursed as she saw the metal spear drop from the sky, raging that after the nukes he was now using kinetic strikes. She forced her giant avatar to meet it head-on, yelling for it to be stopped before it smashed straight into the Imperial Palace. Nebula watched her scramble and let out a short laugh, certain there was no way she could block what was coming. When the impact was over, the Emperor lay buried in broken stone, his palace nothing but shattered walls. Flames swallowed the capital, and even the underground temple under it had collapsed into dust. With the capital wiped out, every bit of faith Hegemonia had piled up there vanished in an instant. As that power drained away, her shining apostle twisted, thinned, and finally disappeared. The system called out Hegemonia's name, then calmly announced that Nebula had won, marking him as the top player once again and offering a brief word of praise. Hegemonia's burning face filled Nebula's screen as she shouted his name, insisting the match could not end like this and begging for just one more game so she could start a new winning streak. Her cry for one more game rang in Nebula's ears as he sat alone in front of his monitor. The system floated a bright prompt in front of him, and his hand moved toward it, ready to decide if their fight was really over. Nebula leaned back and admitted to himself that they had never really had a hidden move. In the end, they were just another set of players he had cleared. The match had shown him nothing new, but it finished the last achievement he needed to hold the top rank. He tightened his fist, thinking it was finally time to move on, when a sharp chime from his screen cut through the quiet. Nebula stared at the message, stunned that everything so far had only been a beta and that there was a real game beyond it. A new window floated on his screen, calmly asking if he wanted to enter. His eyes narrowed as he waited for only a heartbeat, then he moved to accept. When Nebula opened his eyes again, a robed figure waited in a vast stone plaza under a purple sky. The host calmly introduced himself as Aladdin, speaking as if this meeting had been planned for a long time. Nebula glanced around in shock, realizing every god here was hiding behind some kind of mask, just like him. Aladdin explained that this was on purpose, that the masks kept the game fair so no one could gang up based on old ties. He could feel the crowd's questions piling up as Aladdin promised to skip the fluff and move straight to what really mattered. Nebula lifted his gaze to the blue sphere hanging over the plaza and for a second thought it was Earth. Then the details clicked into place, and his expression hardened. He had seen this world far too many times on his monitor to mistake it. Above the shattered stone arena, the planet hung like a cold lantern, and its name burned into every mind as Perished World. This was not just a map from a game anymore. It was the real stage where all of them were about to be dropped. Ladin lifted his hand toward the distant planet and calmly told them that this ruined world would be their new playing field. As his words fell over the plaza, the masked players, Nebula included, felt their bodies blur and stretch, pulled toward the perished world waiting below. Under the twin moons, Nebula stood silent, feeling the fear rolling off the other players. The more he listened to his own gut, the clearer it became that Perished World was not just some game map anymore. The host lifted a hand toward the glowing planet and explained that the gods had once walked there before turning their backs on it. Images of beast riders and scholars from many races flashed by, a hint of the bright age that had been thrown away. One of the old gods lay coiled in the dark, a relic of a time when they still cared for that land. No one knew why beings like this had walked away, only that their absence had turned the whole planet into an open seat for new gods. The plaza settled into a heavy hush as the host faced the ring of masked figures, Nebula among them. Every eye was locked on that single lectern, waiting to hear what this ruined world expected from them. The robed host calmly laid it out. Perished World had been built as a filter, a way to find people fit to guide that broken planet. Just by stepping into this challenge, every player here had been given the right to reach for godhood. The host said the rules would feel familiar. At first, only the desperate and lowly would pray to them, but anyone who could turn that tiny faith into a real following would rise above the rest. Nebula pictured himself hanging over the planet like this, the only god left, free to shape every inch of it as he wished. With the ruined world glowing above them, the host promised that every secret wish they had ever nursed could come true for the one who claimed that throne. All they had to do was turn this dead planet into their own world, and outlast every other would-be god. Nebula broke the spell and asked what happened to the ones who lost. The host did not soften it, explaining that if a rival god took them down here, there would be no waking up back home, only a final end. Nebula moved toward the center, cloak trailing like a slice of night, and for the first time he truly felt the weight of calling this place a real world instead of a game. His heart pounded as it hit him that reaching for godhood here meant betting his actual life, and that every person standing beside him had just agreed to the same risk. He straightened up and treated that danger like a starting line, deciding that if losing meant vanishing for good, then backing down was already the same as losing. Nebula forced himself to calm down and treated Perished World like Lost World again, reminding himself that every run there had started the same way, with a tiny patch of land he could turn into a foothold. While he planned his opening move, Nebula watched several bodies blur and vanish from the ring, quietly counting each person who backed out before the world even loaded. He matched the disappearing figures to what he knew of the servers, realizing they had begun with the full 32 slots, and that only 27 stubborn players were still in the running. The robed host turned toward him and calmly called Nebula up to the table, letting him know he would be the first to draw his starting world as the others watched in silence. As he lifted the glowing card, Nebula guessed that being sent up first meant they were going by world rank, and his eyes widened when the details of his starting region flashed across the surface. Nebula cursed under his breath as the details sank in, knowing he had pulled one of the worst starting regions on the board. Before he could second-guess it, the card flared and a pillar of blue light roared up from the circle, swallowing him and the platform as the other candidates watched. The transfer yanked him out of the ring and hurled his awareness across the stars, straight toward a lonely green-blue world hanging in the dark. The view closed in on a single continent, then narrowed again, fixing his starting point like a pin on a map. Sunlight poured over a quiet valley where a clear river cut between deep green woods and distant hills, everything calm and untouched. High above that peaceful view, a single bright point in the sky marked the god who had just arrived. A fat green frog floated lazily on the river's surface, eyes half closed, until some faint ripple in the air made it perk up and stare toward the sky. The frog's gaze followed a blue butterfly drifting above the water, its wings glowing just a little too bright to be normal, as if the new god were testing his touch on the smallest life around him. Hunger quickly pushed out the frog's brief wonder, and its wide eye dropped from the sky to the silver shape gliding just beneath the surface. With a sudden splash, the frog exploded out of the water and wrapped its hands around a fish almost as long as its body, shouting in delight about how they would be eating well tonight. Another frog rushed in to help hold the thrashing catch, both of them grinning while the blue butterfly circled above like it had planned this little gift. As the frogs settled with their prize, one of them turned and froze for heartbeat, finding the same blue butterfly hovering right by its shoulder, close enough to touch, as if the new god were quietly saying hello. The blue butterfly drifted over the trees, glowing softly, but the frogmen brushed it off, more excited about their catch than some odd bug in the sky. Nebula studied the insect card and reminded himself that this mix had the worst win rate, but he also knew weak pieces could be deadly if the player using them was sharp enough. He sighed when the map marked his spot on the far eastern edge, knowing that being this far out meant few early fights and almost no chance to snowball with a fast, brutal rush. Watching the frogmen snap up bugs between hauling fish, Nebula marked them as the kind of insect-eating race that would mesh perfectly with his starting power. The god's gaze swept over the riverbank, counting rough heads and bodies, and he clicked his tongue inwardly when he reached around 500, far too many to mold as a fresh starting race. As Nebula flipped through other options with a lazy wave, far to the south, a thin line of lizardmen dragged their tired bodies across the desert, unaware that a new god was already weighing their fate. Nebula glanced at the glowing 10 beside his name and knew the rule was strict. With so little faith stored up, he could barely nudge a handful of believers, let alone bend an entire frogman tribe. Wondering what other races lived nearby, Nebula sent his butterflies drifting over the land, and their path settled on that worn-out lizardman band, small enough that even a weak new god could still make a difference. Nebula leaned back on his throne, eyeing the blue display as he noted that the lizardmen also lived off insects, making them a perfect match for the kind of miracles he could afford to use. Out in the burning desert, a thin line of lizardmen dragged themselves forward, their group already thin to the sick, the elderly, and one warrior so badly wounded he could barely keep up, which to a new god meant fewer minds to sway and bodies that already knew hunger. Nebula studied the limping band and decided they must have been cast out, a powerless group with too few fighters left, and his gaze settled on the lizardman clutching his torn shoulder as the clearest sign of how far they had already fallen. Nebula understood that being thrown away by their own kind had hollowed them out, and that this wounded lizardman was already close to breaking. So with just one small wonder, he could step into that emptiness and be accepted as their only god. As the others shuffled toward the blazing horizon, the wounded lizardman trailed alone at the rear, unaware that a distant god had just picked him as the first believer who would change everything. The lizardmen trudged through the baking canyon, every step slower than the last, while a lone beetle clung to the rocks above, the only sign that something in this empty land was paying attention to them. They crashed into the gazelle all at once, claws and tails tangling as they dragged it down in a messy heap, too hungry to care about anything except making sure it could not get away. The wounded hunter hauled a chunk of meat toward the elders, thinking this would finally be his first real meal in days, but the others swarmed the carcass at once, snatching pieces with wild eyes and leaving almost nothing for the ones who could barely stand. As the elders watched the frenzy with tired eyes, the wounded lizardman clutched his torn shoulder and knew the scraps left would never feed the old and the sick, and that some of them might not last much longer. Under the bright desert sky, the lizardmen crowded around the fallen gazelle and tore into it, each one stuffing in as much as they could before the meat was gone. By the time a bird circled overhead, nothing was left but clean bones, and the lizardmen could only admit that the whole gazelle had vanished in moments. Sitting around the stripped skeleton, one of the lizardmen tapped a long leg bone and explained that the rich marrow inside was the best part, a treat they almost never got to taste. He raised the bone to his mouth and bit down hard to crack it open, while the small green youngster beside him watched wide-eyed, waiting to see if this strange leftover really counted as food. When the hunter with the bone spoke up about what to do with the leftovers, the others stared at him like he was crazy, one even grabbing his waist in panic at the thought. The green-eyed hunter tightened his grip on the bone and said they should leave this rich marrow for the old and the sick instead of eating it themselves. Without waiting for anyone to answer, he scooped up the bare ribs and skull, cradling what was left of the gazelle as if it were something precious. The old and wounded lizardmen blinked in surprise when the skeleton was set down before them, their tired eyes fixing on the marrow they had never expected to taste. A moment later, they were all chewing on the bones, sucking out every bit of marrow like it was the best thing they had tasted in years. Off to the side, the badly wounded hunter sat with his ruined shoulder throbbing, nibbling at a thin shard of bone while flies circled the open flesh. One of the hunters finally spoke up, asking the tall one if he really meant to give such rare food to those who could barely move, wondering if that choice made any sense when everyone was starving. The skeptic shrugged and said it did not matter if they were old or sick, because in his mind they were already as good as gone, and another hunter muttered that their wounds only ever seemed to get worse. One of the hunters glanced at the wounded lizardman and admitted he was amazed the guy was even still moving at all. They remembered how Lacrack had thrown himself at the saber-toothed tiger, taking the hit so the others could escape. Now he stood there with his shoulder torn open, and the hunters muttered that, grateful or not, he probably would not last long when there was barely enough food for the healthy ones. Another hunter snapped that talking like that about Lacrack was just plain ungrateful, and the skeptic shot back, asking if he really believed they could spare food for someone who might not make it. The younger lizardman behind them watched in silence, torn between respect and fear. That night, the exiles curled up together on the cold rock, trying to forget their empty stomachs, while Lacrack lay a little apart, clutching his torn shoulder and staring up at the moon with sleep nowhere in sight. Later, one of the hunters noticed Lacrack dragging himself out of the nest of sleeping bodies and nudged his friend awake, whispering that the wounded lizardman was finally leaving. After a brief, uneasy look between them, they agreed to stay quiet and let him go. Lacrack climbed to a lonely ledge and looked back at the tangled shapes of his sleeping kin, sweat and blood running down his arm as he braced himself for whatever waited beyond the rocks. As he climbed, Lacrack wondered if the strange sign he had noticed before was just a trick of his exhausted mind, since none of the others had even twitched when it appeared. Then he spotted it again, a tiny blue butterfly glowing softly against the ice, calmly waiting for him. If this was not a dream, Lacrack thought, then something out there was calling him toward that towering wall of ice for a reason. Lacrack dragged himself up the frozen wall, clutching his ruined shoulder while the blue butterfly floated ahead like a tiny star. Every step hurt, but that soft glow pulled him higher, promising that this climb meant more than just running away. Lacrack hauled himself onto the ledge and froze, staring past the butterfly at a huge, glowing mass pressed against the ice. His eye trembled as he tried to understand what kind of thing could shine like that in a place where nothing lived. Then it hit him, the shining wall was a writhing pillar of beetles, packed so thick they turned the ice into a blue river of shells. Lacrack stared up with his mouth open, sweat mixing with the blood on his chest, as he realized he was looking at more food than his starving group had ever seen. Hope crashed over him as he counted the swarming backs in his head and saw there was more than he could ever eat alone. This was enough to fill every empty belly in the lounge, Even the old and the sick they had almost given up on. Or above, the system flashed that Lizardman Group 1121 had reached a revelation, and Nebula watched the notice float among his blue screens. The skull-masked god saw Lacrack before the Beetle Mountain and let out a quiet breath of relief, glad his first gamble had finally paid off. On the glowing windows, Nebula watched the starving lizardmen tear into piles of beetles, fires crackling as laughter slowly replaced groans. He judged that this haul would keep the whole lounge alive for a few days, and his mind jumped ahead, already lining up what he needed to push them past simple survival. Nebula paused mid-thought as a new flicker on the screens drew his eye, and a hint of surprise slipped into his calm gaze. Something down there was moving in a way he had not ordered. Down by the fire, the lizardmen were already passing beetles around, pressing extra into the hands of the thin and the slow without anyone telling them to. Watching them share his gift on their own, Nebula quietly marked that this race, thrown away to die, still had enough will to look after each other. Nebula tilted his skull mask slightly, the stars on his cloak rippling as his thoughts settled on the lizardmen who had climbed for him. While the outcasts warmed themselves around the fire, Nebula's gaze locked onto Lacrack alone, weighing the stubborn survivor in front of him. The god's lips curled into a small, pleased smile as he decided this one was worth betting on. Lacrack handed out beetles with his bad shoulder still bleeding, never keeping the best pieces for himself. Watching that, Nebula marked him as a cornerstone for everything to come, and in return, quietly vowed to lift this wounded outcast higher than any of them could imagine. The sky above was clear and bright, almost too peaceful for a group that close to collapse. Lone blue butterfly drifted over the rocky cliffs, its glow marking a path only a god could see. Lacrack shaded his eyes and stared ahead, wondering if the strange butterfly in this place were just his mind playing tricks on him again. Behind him, the lizardmen burst into cheers as beetles poured in again, the promise of full stomachs wiping away their fear for a moment. One of the lizardmen clutched Lacrack's arm, asking if their leader was still chasing those strange visions that had led them to food so far. Their shadows stretched over the cracked earth as Lacrack pointed out that winter was closing in, yet every beetle still crawled from the side of the land that already felt icy. Lacrack's face hardened as his follower stammered that if they kept chasing the beetles into that cold, the whole group might not survive the journey. The worried lizardman spread his hands, asking if they should forget about the visions and turn aside, torn between the food that kept saving them and the cold that might end them. Lacrack bares his teeth and reminds him how dead that land looked when they passed through it. The canyon ahead stretches out dry and bare, nothing but rock and dust to prove the doubter's point. Lacrack gazes up at the sky and admits that even he is not sure these visions mean anything at all. Far above, Nebula studies the glowing window and blames his own lack of faith for why he can only nudge Lacrack forward, instead of granting real protection. The god fixes his gaze on Lacrack's image, and decides that if these lizardmen choose to trust him, he will turn that faith into something world-shaking. Lacrack hauls the child up the rocky path with the whole worn-out group behind him, still chasing the tiny blue guide as if it really could lead them to a future none of them can picture. At the foot of the towering cliffs, Lacrack and the others stop and stare up at the glowing butterfly, realizing this climb is the price of the future they were promised. Lacrack snaps out of his daze, whirls on the tribe, and bellows for everyone's attention. Lacrack throws his arm toward the green valley and shining lakes below, calling this place the sanctuary their nameless beetle god promised. The worn-out lizardmen crowd behind him, staring down at water and trees they never dreamed of. Faces that were empty with fear a day ago now light up with hope. The tribe erupts in a roar that shakes the air, fists raised high. Lacrack stands in the middle of it, hand pressed to his chest, sweat on his face as the weight of their trust finally hits him. All around the oasis, voices shout that they are going to live after all. The lizardmen call out Lacrack's name again and again, insisting that reaching this place is all thanks to him. The cheers stretch into a distant blur, and the bright world seems to narrow into a single sharp point. For Lacrack, joy and fear mix together as if something vast is about to break into his mind. In the deep blue beyond the sky, the nameless beetle god leans close and offers Lacrack a role. Become the one who carries the god's words. Nebula taps his glowing window, sealing the choice, while down below Lacrack stands at the center of the tribe, unaware that his life is being rewritten. Pillar of blue light crashes down around Lacrack, strange signs burning in the air as the blessing takes root. The other lizardmen stare wide-eyed while their guide stands in the glow, feeling power sink into his flesh that will carry all of them forward. Night settles over the sanctuary, the moon shining through thick leaves as the lizardmen lie scattered on the grass, bellies full at last. Their tools and bowls rest beside limp hands, and the whole group drifts into a deep, careless sleep they have not known in years. Lacrack finds himself floating in soft blue light, blue butterflies circling as he wonders if he is still asleep. A warm glow forms around him, calling his name, and he lifts his head toward it, sensing that the unknown god he followed is at last about to speak to him face to face. In the blue glow, a tall figure reached its hand toward Lacrack. Lacrack stared at it and wondered if the god wanted him to take it. As the hand hovered closer, Lacrack's throat went dry, and he guessed the god might be trying to ask him something instead of just wanting a touch. A sharp jolt ran through him, and Lacrack's eyes flew open as he suddenly found himself sitting upright in the light. He looked down and froze when he saw a huge horned skull resting in his lap. With a strange pull in his chest, Lacrack lifted it up toward the shining sky. He set the skull over the figure's head, and it fit as if it had always belonged there. In that instant, Lacrack understood that this was the nameless beetle god he had followed. The cloaked giant rose before him, buffalo skull gleaming, cloak speckled like a night full of stars while blue butterflies spun around it. Faced with that shape, Lacrack could only tremble in awe. Back in the bright valley, Lacrack faced the others and wrapped up his tail, saying that this was everything that had happened while he slept. The lizardmen traded uneasy looks and asked what their new god expected from them. One of them wondered if the nameless beetle god wanted them to bring down a buffalo as an offering. One of the hunters reminded everyone that chasing a buffalo meant going far into the wild, where anything could happen, and that the danger might be too much for their small group. Another hunter pushed back, saying the one asking for the offering was also the one who led them to safety, but he admitted he hated the thought of putting the whole lounge in danger for it. They all pictured it clearly. A raging buffalo big as a boulder, horns lowered, forcing every able hunter to fight just to stay alive. One of the lizardmen finally asked who would guard the old and the children if every strong hunter left to chase a single beast. Lacrec listened in silence and had to admit to himself that they were right. He could not gamble the whole lounge on one offering. His jaw tightened as he decided he would not drag the others into this, no matter how important the sacrifice felt. Lacrec took up his spear and calmly announced that he would go after the buffalo alone so the others could stay and guard the weak. The others burst out in shock, calling his plan madness and begging him not to throw his life away. But Lacrec only met their eyes and tried to calm them, insisting he was doing this to keep them safe, not because he did not care. Lacrec steadied his voice and told them that his god had already blessed him, as if that alone was reason enough to trust his choice. One of the hunters stared at him, stunned, and asked if Lacrec was really saying he had received an actual blessing from a god. Lacrec shifted slightly, and the strange dark patterns along his shoulder caught the light, quiet proof that his body was no longer the same. The hunters glanced around the valley, at the heavy fruit hanging from the trees and the spear glowing faintly in Lacrec's grip, remembering how a nameless god had led them here in the first place. Lacrec admitted that it still felt unreal to him too, but he told them that when he woke after meeting the god, every wound on his body was simply gone. He raised his arm and showed them how his shoulders were now wrapped in thick black scales that had never been there before. The hunters traded uneasy looks as Lacrec said the scales were like a beetle's shell, a mark that tied his body to the strange insect god that had saved them. One of the older hunters rubbed his face and confessed that it was hard to believe any of this. Yet with Lacrec standing there changed, he could no longer dismiss it as a simple dream. One of the hunters argued that even a blessing was not enough reason for Lacrec to go after a buffalo by himself. But Lacrec only tightened his grip on the spear and got ready to show them why he was so sure. Lacrec said that was not even the real reason he could go alone, and his arms swelled with power as the black scales shifted and his muscles bunched like coiled rope. He claimed that this strength was the real reason, then whipped the spear forward, sending it screaming through the air so fast it turned into a streak over the valley. Far away, the spear smashed into a buffalo with a blinding burst of force, dropping the huge beast on the spot, and every lizardman who saw it could only stare with their mouths open, shaken by what Lacrec had just done. Lacrec went straight to work, cutting down the thick grass and stalks around the stump as if bringing down a buffalo from that distance was nothing special. One of the hunters yelled that something was wrong, since a buffalo herd was supposed to follow the same path every season, not suddenly appear under their cliff like this. Hunter tried to hold Lacrec back, still tangled in worries, but Lacrec only flashed a sharp grin, shifted the spear in his hand, and sprinted straight toward the cliff. He hurled himself off the rock face without slowing, roaring that this would be the day their tribe finally broke free from hunger. As he dropped, the spear he had thrown earlier tore through the sky like a pillar of light, racing the falling hunter to the ground below. The spear slammed into a buffalo and dropped it where it stood, and the rest of the herd burst into wild panic around the fallen giant. The hunters charged down the slope, shouting as they ran to seize the fallen buffalo, while Lacrec told them that their god's grace was not limited to beetles anymore, but now reached rich meat as well. By night, the oasis glowed with firelight and smoke rising in a tall column, the once starving outcasts feasting together as if the whole valley itself had started to answer their prayers. They hung the buffalo over the mound of skulls, letting its blood run down and soak the bone altar in front of the fire. The lizardmen stood before the flames, and their leader raised his head and begged their nameless god to accept the buffalo as their offering. As blood dripped into a dark pool beneath the skull, their voices grew louder, begging again for their god to take this gift and not abandon them. Nebula watched their worship and admitted to himself that after all the work he had poured into this tribe, this much faith felt earned. But he also knew there were hard limits to what he could do for them. Since he could not just summon water and grass from nothing, the blue god decided he would need help from his tiny friends, guiding insects and buffalo so the little greenery that did exist could keep them alive. Studying the numbers, Nebula saw that every feast like this just carved away at their own future, since none of them yet knew how to raise or manage the cattle they were so eager to eat. From high above, the oasis looked bright and safe, but Nebula knew it could only support this many bodies for a few short years, and unless they learned how to grow food and keep animals, the tribe would slide back into the same slow hunger they had just escaped. The god tapped his mask, thinking that herding and farming were far beyond what this tribe could figure out alone, yet the rules barred him from simply handing them the answers, so he began planning a roundabout path, one that would take time but still nudge them toward that future. Nebula lifted his hand and let a thin stream of power fall, a trail of blue stars pouring down onto the bone altar. The beam linked sky and earth, washing over the lizardmen as they knelt, a small blessing meant to keep this tiny oasis from failing too fast. Morning light spilled over the clear water and green banks, making the valley look almost perfect. At the center, the Tower of Buffalo Skull stood quiet and proud, as if the night's blue light had sealed it under a calm sky. Lacrec stood at the foot of the skull mound, studying every bone as he admitted he had woken early because a strange dream about this altar would not leave his mind. When a hunter asked if it had been a vision from their god, Lacrec admitted he was not sure, Only that in the dream he had watched this very altar sway dangerously far away, as if ready to topple. In the dream, the nail that had held their long-lasting blessing shook, while the river gave nothing back and the fields lay scraped clean, the soil so tired that not a single new plant pushed through. One of the warriors reminded Lacrek that their nets were still coming back heavy, and the grass around them was still green, saying their god would not let them fall. Lacrek agreed out loud, but his hand stayed on the altar, holding tight to the dream he could not shake. Later, from a high perch beside the skull totems, Lacrek suddenly pointed across the plain, spotting a long line of shapes kicking up dust where the desert met the hills. As the riders came into focus, Lacrek's jaw tightened. The dream of the shaking altar finally made sense. A whole other band of lizardmen was marching in on giant beasts, and he knew these were the ones who would try to push his people out of their hard-won home. Huge sand-colored beast padded over the dry ground, its jaws full of teeth and its back loaded with blue-scaled riders. Behind it, row after row of lizardmen marched in tight lines, turning the dusty plain into a moving wall of bodies. From his perch on the skulls, Lacrek shaded his eyes and stared across the plain, then muttered that it really was them again. The warrior at his side tensed, knowing exactly which enemies he meant. Lacrek picked out their thick blue scales, the heavy frames that matched the tribe they once were cast out from, and the way they sat high on trained monsters. Hardly anyone else in these lands could field riders like that. Watching the long column stretch across the desert, Lacrek guessed that this was not a raid but their whole tribe on the move. If they were bringing everyone, they were not planning to turn back easily. Far away, the place they once called home lay wasted. Trees dead and soil cracked around a shrinking pool, the land stripped bare by years of hunger and drought. Lacrek narrowed his eyes, turning the thought over in silence as a new, uneasy idea began to form. He wondered aloud if the Blue Leather tribe was also roaming the desert in search of a new place to live, just like they once had. The younger lizardmen shifted uneasily, not ready to believe that yet. Out on the plain, the Blue Leather warriors pushed forward behind their monster riders, a sea of blue scales filling the gap between the cliffs. Lacrek's scout guessed they were just drifting through the desert without any idea that an oasis waited ahead, the same way his own people once had. Before Lacrek could decide anything, a patrol warrior suddenly shouted out to the marching tribe below. The patrol rushed to the cliff edge, baring teeth and raising spears as they yelled that this land was the sanctuary of the nameless beetle god. From the top of the rocks, the patrol waved their weapons and warned the Blue Leather tribe that they would not be allowed to step into the oasis. The Blue Leather leader pulled his beast to a halt, staring up at the shouting figures with a puzzled look, as if he had no idea why they were being blocked. Lacrek pressed a hand to his head when he recognized the voice, groaning as he remembered that Yuri was the one on patrol today. The chief laid a hand on his companion's shoulder and told him to relax, acting as if this sudden clash was still under control. Then Lacrek sprang down from his perch, deciding that this might be a sign from their god and that he should face the Blue Leather tribe himself. Behind him, the young warrior tightened his grip on his spear, asking what Lacrek meant by calling this trouble a sign from their god. The young warrior hurried up behind Lacrek, asking if their god was really pushing them into fights on purpose. Lacrek rested on his spear, looking more thoughtful than shocked by the question. Lacrek said he doubted this was just some test, and that it felt more like a task their god wanted them to carry out. He spoke of the Blue Leather tribe as people who had once been one with them, saying their duty now was to pull them in and save them rather than push them away. Even so, Lacrek said that if this really was part of their god's vision, they had no choice but to follow it, whether they fully understood it or not. Yet the memory of their own hardship lingered, and one of the blue-scaled lizardmen wondered why a god who knew their struggle would push another hungry tribe toward the same narrow land. A cluster of bright blue butterflies drifted down from the sky, and one stopped right in front of Lacrek, making him tense as he realized this was a direct sign from their god. Staring at the butterfly, Lacrek decided this could only be their god's will, and told himself he had no right to dig any deeper into the reason. As the butterfly glided away over the cliffs, Lacrek made up his mind to shoulder this task himself, and lead both tribes toward the future their god had shown. Lacrek followed the blue butterfly back toward the others, treating it like a direct order. As it hovered over the lizardmen, he stepped forward, ready to play the part of his god's own apostle. Far above, Nebula lounged on his strange throne, eyes fixed on the image of Lacrek. Seeing the way the lizardmen moved, he felt that this follower really did grasp what he wanted. In Nebula, these two tribes were never meant to stay apart. He needed them merged into one people so their numbers and their skills could grow fast enough to build a real civilization. Watching Lacrek guide his warriors, Nebula realized he had never spelled any of this out. Lacrek had chosen this path on his own, without being pushed step by step. The system marked Lacrek's will as 14, far higher than Nebula had expected from an exile. The god studied that number and the calm look on Lacrek's face and started to wonder if this one could grow into something much greater. Even when facing a rival tribe, Lacrek's first thought had been to join hands, and Nebula found that kind of judgment surprisingly pleasing. Nebula was satisfied. This was exactly the kind of stubborn leader he needed at the front. If he could deepen that belief inside Lacrek and others like him, he would not have to steer every tiny choice himself. With that, his wishes could flow through the tribe on their own, carried by Lacrek's fierce resolve. Lacrek crouched on the rocky ledge as the Blue Leather warriors gathered below with their heavy beasts. Both sides stared up at each other, the air tight with the question of whether this would turn into a battle or a pact. The Blue Leather chief tugged on his mount's reins and looked up with a wide, toothy grin. He shouted up at the ledge, asking the noisy strangers if this rocky place was really where they lived. The Blue Leather chief barked back from his mount, calling the lizard men on the cliff noisy kids and loudly claiming that this land already belonged to his tribe. The chief leaned back with a lazy grin, acting like their anger was nothing more than a joke. He spread his arms toward the bare rocks above, scoffing that nothing worth taking could be up there and telling them to stop poking into his business. The chief waved a hand at the cliffs, saying it was probably just a few trees and shrubs at best. Lacrek stepped forward onto the dry ground beside the old skull, ready to show that this land held far more than the stranger thought. Marching at the head of his warriors, Lacrek answered that this place gave them life, the food and water that kept their people standing. Lacrek met the chief's gaze and added that beyond food and water, this was also their god's domain, the very realm of the nameless beetle god. Blue Leather Chief muttered that Lacrek even talked like a wild barbarian, but shrugged it off as something that did not really matter to him. Lacrek's eyes stayed cold as he told the Blue Leather warriors to leave this place. The Blue Leather Chief tugged on his beast's reins, saying they would spare everyone if Lacrek's people turned around and left now. The huge lizard beast lowered its head and bared its teeth, as if daring anyone to test the chief's claim that they could not be beaten. Rows of blue leather warriors filled the canyon behind him, and the chief joked that any real leader should be able to count and see how badly the numbers favored his side. Lacrek closed his eyes for breath, more bored than shaken, and decided there was no point trading any more words. Sunlight flashed along the edge of Lacrek's spear as he lifted it, giving his answer without another word. Striding to the cliff's edge with his spear pointed down at the chief, Lacrek said he had no time for pointless exchanges and was ready to settle things here. The Blue Leather Chief's smug look slipped as Lacrek called his people lost lambs, driven from their homes. Raising his staff high, the lizardman leader told them that even now their god's arms were open, ready to claim this place and everyone who stood in the way. Lacrek lifted his spear high and promised to drag this tribe into his god's embrace, whether they liked it or not. The Blue Leather Chief's smirk twisted into wild laughter, as if Lacrek's offer was the funniest thing he had ever heard. Still grinning, the chief poked at Lacrek's spear and mocked him for not being able to count how badly he was outnumbered. Lacrek only smiled back, saying that the only thing he trusted here was his god. He shifted his grip on the stone blade and stood there at ease, as if this whole army was nothing more than a small chore. The Blue Leather Chief's smile faded as he snarled that Lacrek was too stupid to understand anything he was saying. With a cruel shout, the chief dug his heels into the beast's sides, sending the roaring monster thundering straight at Lacrek. Lacrek planted his feet on the dry ground and tightened both hands around his stone axe as a faint light wrapped around the blade. He was ready to stake his life, his courage, and every bit of strength he had on this one stand. Lacrek lifted his gaze to the sky and begged his heavenly father to lend him strength against the monster bearing down on him. He promised to match that gift with his own courage and power, asking to be allowed to stand his ground just once more. The mounted beast crashed down toward him, claws spread wide while the Blue Leather Chief yanked hard on the reins. Lacrek raised his spear into that falling shadow and begged his god to answer him now, before everything ended. Instead of turning into some blessed relic, the worn shaft of his weapon burst apart in his hands, scattering splinters through the air. Lacrek stared at the broken handle, sweat beading on his snout as he realized he was now standing barehanded in front of that charging beast. The Blue Leather Chief burst into cruel laughter on the beast's back, calling Lacrek a fool for trusting in a god instead of numbers. The monster's huge claw filled Lacrek's vision, ready to smash him flat. The system chimed in, calmly calling this life or death charge a clash of civilizations and promising huge gains in experience for both sides. Watching from his dark throne, Nebula let out a slow breath, knowing how close he had just come to losing his first tribe before they even began. Nebula read the notice that his focus on this one outcast group had pulled them fully into his domain, marking them as Lizardmen LV. 1. With that came a list of fresh skills waiting to be used, and without a hint of doubt he reached out and chose to accept them. Down on the cracked earth, Lacrek stood alone as the beast's claw came crashing toward him, bright light swallowing his outline. This was the instant when either his god's choice would reach him, or he would be gone. Lacrek's jaw tightened as a strange warmth rose behind his eyes. The world around him dimmed, and a sharp blue star bloomed in his gaze. A blinding blue star crashed down between Lacrek and the beast, forcing the monster's claws to skid aside. Dust and light burst outward, turning a sure end into a narrow escape. The drakes rushed tore a deep line through the ground as the blue wall shoved it sideways. The rider clung to the reins, shocked that his perfect strike had been turned into a wild slide. The Blue Leather Chief chuckled, thinking Lacrek had just gotten lucky. Then he froze as he saw the outcast standing firm below, wrapped in a roaring blue aura that hadn't been there a moment ago. Behind Lacrek, a giant skull of blue light rose like a second body, its hollow eyes fixed on the battlefield. Lacrek stood at its heart, calm and steady, as if his god had just stepped down to stand with him. The Blue Leather Chief forced a grin, barking that whatever trick saved Lacrek once would not save him again. He dug his heels into the drake's sides, sending the beast thundering forward in a fresh, furious charge. Lacrek watched the oncoming drake without flinching as the blue glow thickened around him. His eyes sharpened, the strange symbol inside it spinning to life as a power called foresight opened his view of the fight. The system laid out clean numbers in front of Lacrek's mind, weighing the Blue Leather warrior's modest strength against the drake's brutal power. Beating the rider alone was easy. The real problem was facing both lizardman and beast at once, a pair that even his new strength could not ignore. Lacrek's hand clamped down on the drake's snout as blue light poured from his body. The system calmly explained that his new title gave him divinity, a single point worth more than any normal blessing. That power flashed in his eyes, a bolt of white lightning snapping between them as his will hardened. Using that borrowed might, Lacrek yanked the charging Drake off balance and dragged the huge body along the canyon floor. Dust and rock flew around them, and the blue glow around him only grew brighter. A group of exiled lizardmen watched from below, mouths hanging open as they realized what their outcast was doing. The Drake's long body lay stretched across the cracked earth, pinned between the two groups, while Lacrek stood alone in front of it wrapped in blue light. Warriors from both tribes stared at him, their fear of the beast already fading into something closer to awe. After seeing that one move, every watcher understood just how far beyond them his strength now was. The Drake's jaw hung open, its strength spent, dust curling from its nostrils. Nearby, black-scale warriors pumped their fists and shouted, thrilled by the impossible turn. Lacrek did not join their joy. He stood under the falling blue light, eyes steady, as if the fight inside him was not over yet. The black-scale warriors could not hold back anymore and burst into excited shouts, calling the move amazing and bragging that their side had already won. Their earlier fear of the Drake was gone, replaced by wild pride in the blue-lit fighter standing ahead. As the cheering died down a little, the leading warrior stared at the glowing figure and finally put it together. That monster of strength was not some stranger or spirit, but Lacrek, the exile they had once written off. Crushed under his own mount, the blue leather chief spat curses at Lacrek, insisting that only some trick could explain this loss. Even while pinned, he stretched his arm across the dirt until his fingers wrapped around the fallen dagger, clinging to any chance to strike back. The blue leather chief staggered free and rushed at Lacrek, dagger raised high, shouting for his warriors not to drop their guard. He clung to the numbers he had trusted before the fight, swearing that his careful calculations could not possibly be wrong even as the blue glow ahead proved otherwise. Before the dagger can matter, Lacrek's hand tightens and he whips the chief through the air, blue light tearing across the canyon. The enemy leader slams away like a broken toy, and the fight ends in a single, brutal motion. Lacrek straightens beside the Drake's body, blue light still falling around him, and calmly calls out for whoever wants to step up next. The only answer from the blue leather warriors is the clatter of blades hitting the ground as their courage finally gives out. Kneeling lizardmen stretch out before Lacrek, heads bowed low in the dust. A wounded blue leather warrior looks up at him with shaking eyes and admits that it is over, surrendering their tribe into his hands. Looking down at the crushed Drake and scattered warriors, Lacrek can barely believe those moves came from his own body, wondering if his god had moved through him. To him, the whole battle feels unreal, like a dream, while far above, the horned, star-cloaked god simply watches in silence. Night falls over the canyon, fires glowing warm where enemies had stood hours before. Around the main bonfire, lizardmen from both sides sit together, and one of the blue leather warriors finally asks if Lacrek's followers are really the broken tribe that once vanished into the wilderness. One of Lacrek's companions nods and tells them it is true, their tribe had been thrown out to die. He explains that they only lived because they trusted the nameless beetle god, and that following that god's signs slowly turned them into the strong warrior sitting here now instead of bones lost in the wilds. Blue leather warrior stares up at the rough shrine of horns and skulls, mulling over the talk of a new god. He admits that if this nameless beetle god could grant such power to one lizardman, then that god must be truly great, and his neighbor quietly reminds him that everyone saw proof of it in the canyon today. While the others whisper that they never dreamed a lizardman could hold power like his, Lacrek sits with his hands clasped, eyes lowered. The cheers and awe wash over him, but his mind is already turning toward what this strength will mean for his tribe's future. The leaves rustled softly in the warm canyon wind, as if the land itself was finally relaxing after the battle. The Drake's roar had once shaken the canyon, its jaws gaping over a lone lizardman who looked tiny under that crushing weight. Now the Drake could only growl, haunted by the memory of its own body being hurled aside by Lacrek like a toy. Its heavy feet shuffled on the grass, the proud beast now unsure whether to fight or flee from the warrior who broke it. Lacrek stepped forward with an armful of thick roots, holding them out with a calm face, as if he were greeting a guest instead of a monster. The warrior stretched one root toward the Drake, inviting it to take the food instead of testing his strength again. The Drake snapped up the root, chewing as the nearby warriors stared in disbelief. Lacrek watched its jaws work and asked if the beast still wanted more or if that was enough for now. As the Drake crunched through another root, Lacrek looked at it and wondered out loud why the nameless beetle god had let it live. Certain there had to be some purpose behind that mercy. Lacrek saw the Drake still begging and told it the roots were finished, warning that if it was going to stay with him, it would have to learn patience. Later, Lacrek sat with the elder and asked what had held their tribe back before, and the old lizardman admitted it was always a lack of wood. Lacrek checked that he meant real trees, then calmly said they had extra now since their people barely burned any. When asked if they only needed it for campfires, the elder shook his head and explained they had once burned wood to make a special kind of fuel. Lacrek rolled a twig between his fingers, said he understood, and promised to think it over and give his answer the next day. As the talk ended and the others drifted off between the trees, Lacrek caught a strange glow around one of the blue-scaled lizardmen and turned, sensing that this visitor was not just another tribesman. The speckled lizardman stepped forward and said he had heard they were searching for guide. And Lacrek, studying the glow around him, answered that this must be the wanderer they had been told about. The old wanderer spoke of years spent drifting from place to place, never settling, until one day he gained the strange gift to see hidden pathways in the land. Hearing that, Lacrek leaned in and checked that this meant the old lizardmen could lead their people along safe routes. The wanderer spoke of valleys and riverbanks he had seen, places green enough that none of them would have to go hungry if they settled there. Then he admitted he could not promise they were still empty, since other wanderers or whole tribes might have reached them first. Lacrek said that was fine, because if any group in those lands raised their claws against them, the black scales would just crush the threat and keep the territory. Hearing that hard promise, the wanderer nodded, saying that with such clear intent he could place his trust in them. Lacrek studied the old drifter and asked if he could trust in the same faith, not just walk the same road. The wanderer did not answer right away, and simply raised a finger toward the bright sky. Lacrek followed the gesture, frowning a little as he asked if the wanderer meant the sky itself or something beyond it. The old lizardman said his answer lay past the blue above them, and grinning, added that his faith was set on what waited beyond the sky. Later that night, as they stared up at the glittering sky, Lacrek guessed that the wanderer had meant the stars themselves, and the other lizardmen quietly agreed. Lacrek stood under the trees, lost in thought about those distant lights, when Yuri hurried over, and Lacrek asked if Manhwa was causing problems again. Yuri admits that Manhwa still looks grumpy about his meals, but says the beast now waits as calmly as a well-trained hound whenever its food arrives on time, and the drake lies stretched out in the grass to prove it. Hearing that, Lacrek nodded in relief and turned away, but Yuri called after him, reminding him that he had once said their people needed a way to travel without starving, and Lacrek calmly agreed that he had. As Lacrek calmly fed the once wild drake, the lizardman beside him admitted that watching Lacrek tame such a hungry beast had just brought back an important idea. Later, under the blue nightlight, Yuri wondered out loud if they could do the same with a different kind of creature. When Lacrek asked what she meant, she explained that she was thinking about taming another species entirely, and then pointed toward a distant group, saying those were the ones she had in mind. Nebula thought back to how humans once stood in deserts and river valleys, turning wild land into fields and herds. Some pushed plows through the soil, while others learned to breed and raise animals for meat, milk, and strength. At his glowing console, Nebula remembered learning all of that inside the game, how every strong human kingdom had grown beside steady rivers. To him, farming was the safe path, the one that kept people fed even when hunts failed. But in this world, Nebula had not picked humans at all. His choice was the lizardmen, already strong enough to drag raging beasts to the ground with their bare hands. With tough bodies and a knack for surviving harsh land, the lizardmen could cross dry plains beside their herds without slowing down. For them, raising and moving livestock promised more growth than tying themselves to fixed fields. Watching them on the screen, Nebula knew muscle and cattle alone would not be enough. His people would have to leap ahead with new tools and ideas if they wanted to outgrow simple herding. Down in the village, lizardman Smith sweated over blazing pits as dull ore turned into bright, flowing metal. Their first crude iron might be weaker than bronze, but for a tribe that once only swung stone, it was a huge step. When Smith clasped his hands around the long rod and steadied his breath while the molten iron swirled inside the mold, bright as the sun. Everyone nearby watched in silence, knowing this glowing ring could change how their tribe fought and worked. Hammer blows rang out until the glow faded and clear edges formed. When the work was done, a neat line of iron blades lay cooling on the ground, simple but sharp enough to push the lizardmen into a new age. Nebula watched the new iron blades on his screens, knowing they were still softer than bronze but miles ahead of rough stone. For a tribe that once swung rocks, even these crude tools marked the start of a different age. As more scenes from the village floated around him, Nebula realized iron was not the only surprise. His followers had stumbled onto something else he had not planned for at all. Far below, a lone lizardman stood under the night sky, eyes fixed on the glittering points of light as if trying to read a pattern only he could see. The chief joined the blue-scaled watcher in the clearing, both of them staring up at the same scattered lights. Even the children copied them, and without knowing the word for it, the tribe had taken its first step into astronomy. Nebula knew they were still just guessing at the lights above, but he hoped this quiet stargazer would keep chasing answers. Down in the valley, the chief clapped the blue lizardman's shoulder, already treating him as the tribe's guide to the heavens. Above the camp, the stars burned like bright nails hammered into the sky, while below, fresh iron spears waited in a neat row. To the tribe, both the weapons and the lights overhead now felt like gifts guiding their strength. Later, the chief sat on the cliff edge, watching the stars hang over his sleeping people. With iron in their hands and a stargazer at their side, he knew he had to decide where to lead them next. Down in the valley, fires lit up the lake as the tribe gathered around a towering shrine of bones and horns, its surface glowing in the flames. Their small camp no longer felt like a band of exiles, but the start of a people with their own god, tools, and stars to follow. The lizardmen closest to the fire watched their chief, throats tight and eyes shining, already guessing that tonight he would change everything for them. The chief reminded everyone how long it had been since their god led them to this land, how they had found the tribe that once cast them out, and how easy it would have been to stay apart and settle old grudges instead of growing together. He said their god had chosen forgiveness instead, stretching the lives of their old brothers, because without the clan's help, those wanderers would have simply faded away in the wild. Standing before the Shrine of Skulls, the chief admitted that casting them off again would have stained the whole tribe, and that their god had warned them they would only grow stronger by adding more hands and hearts to their people. Then he ended the talk with a clear order. When the sun rose, they would break camp and walk away from this first home their god had given them. As murmurs ran through the crowd, the chief called the quiet watcher of the sky to his side, telling everyone that for days this man had tracked the stars for him, and that every pattern he spoke of had matched what the heavens actually did. With the stars as his proof, the chief named the stargazer as the tribe's new guide, the one they would follow whenever they had to choose a path. The chief told the gathered lizardmen that from now on they would trust this stargazer to lead them to new lands, then turned to the nervous guide and asked him to tell the whole tribe which way the stars were pointing them. The stargazer lifted his hand toward the night sky, and the tribe watched in silence as if the stars themselves were answering him. Calm but sure of himself, the stargazer told them that if they followed his directions, the path of the stars would lead them to a vast forest with no end. In his mind, that forest spread out under bright daylight, thick with wild beasts and crowded with all kinds of living things. Standing beside him, the chief laughed and told the others that what the stargazer really meant was simple. That wild, crowded forest would be a rich place for their people to live. After that, the chief thanked the stargazer in front of everyone, patted his head, and told him he could step back now, his work for the night done. The chief turned away and climbed the mound of skulls, his foot pressing onto a bleached horned head as he took his place above the crowd. The lizardmen stared up, sweat beading on their snouts, while the chief rose above them on the bones, framed by the stars like a shadow of their god. Chief called for Yuri, and the brown-scaled hunter jerked his head up, shouting back his answer before he even knew what would be asked of him. From his place above the bones, the chief stared down at Yuri and demanded to know why the hunter had refused to eat any of the buffalo he brought back yesterday, making the whole tribe wait for his answer. The fire roared in the valley while Yuri stared up at the chief, feeling every eye on his back as he tried to find the right words. Yuri finally blurts out that he kept the buffalo untouched because it felt like the wrong move. The chief narrows his eyes and points out that the other hunters were just as tired, asking why Yuri stopped them from eating too. The hunters in the crowd tense up, waiting to hear if he has a real reason or just selfish greed. Yuri says he knew everyone was hungry and worn out, but he decided they would still make it through the night without that meat. In his mind, saving it now mattered more than easing their stomachs for a few moments. He tells them that if they can endure a bit of hunger today, that stored meat might save their lives when real starvation hits later. The hunters beside him glance over, weighing his words against their empty bellies. The chief studies him in silence for a moment, then his hard face eases into a grin as he says Yuri handled it well. Yuri and the others blink up at him, shocked that the challenge turned into approval. The chief tells everyone that Yuri had every reason to dig into the water buffalo right away, but forced himself to wait for the sake of the tribe's future. He calls that kind of restraint a good thing, the sort of thinking their people need to survive. Then the chief says that Yuri was not the only one who held back, and that every hunter who did the same has earned a spear of their own. The promise hangs in the warm air like a badge of trust and duty. The chosen hunters clutch their fresh spears, eyes shining as the metal tips gleam in the firelight, while others in the crowd whisper that they want one too. One lizardman watches quietly and realizes the chief has been thinking ahead all along, using hunger and reward to guide the tribe's future. The chief rests his hand on the skull mask and tells the tribe that their steps, even hungry ones like today, are always taken with their god beside them. He says the road ahead will be long, but with courage, patience, and their god's help, they can handle it. Then the chief lowers the heavy skull onto Yuri's head, claiming him in front of everyone as the warrior who will carry that will. Yuri stands atop the bone mound in the skull mask, spear in hand, looking every bit like a chosen guardian of the tribe. Inside the mask, his eye shines with tears as it sinks in that their god has accepted him as a true warrior. The chief looks over the valley one last time and calmly tells everyone that their time at this holy mound is over and they have to move on. He tells them that even if they leave this sacred mound behind, they will still reach the place meant for them as long as their god walks with them. Down below, the older lizardman and the younger one with red marks trade a look, feeling both scared and strangely hopeful about that promise. Spears shoot up as the chief calls them toward a brighter future, telling them to march and not slow down. The lizardmen fall into lines and move out from the glowing bone mound, stepping into the dark land ahead with their new faith in Yuri's skull mask leading the way. As the tribe starts its long march, a blue butterfly drifts over the ground, carrying their plea for the nameless beetle god to watch over them. Yuri walks with the mask held high, then lowers his head and quietly admits to the nameless beetle god that he might have gone too far, asking to be forgiven for calling his own thoughts divine. Far above, Nebula lets the butterfly rest on his fingers and calmly thinks that Yuri has nothing to apologize for, since he would never have picked him as high priest if he did not stand by Yuri's decisions. The god flicks his hand and a blue window opens, showing Yuri's trust and warrior levels jumping up, and he quietly praises how Yuri's choice pushed the whole group to grow. Nebula's eye glows behind the skull mask as he turns his thoughts from Yuri to Lakrek and the other key lizardmen guiding this fragile tribe. Another window shows Lakrek's numbers soaring, his leadership and priest levels nearly doubling, and Nebula feels fully pleased as he watches Lakrek stride through the marching crowd without having let him down once. Lakrek holds his kin close while he walks, and Nebula decides that with leaders like this in place, the easy part is over and the real game is finally starting. Under the burning sun, the long line of lizardmen wins between red cliffs, leaving the bone mound behind as they push into the empty desert where their god plans to build their new world. One of the lizardmen finally breaks, lifting his head to the burning sky and letting out a strained cry as the heat and hunger hit him all at once. Yuri stops in his tracks as the worn-out lizardman drops into the sand beside him, the trail already claiming its first real victim of exhaustion. The warriors crowd around the lizardman sprawled on the ground, and the blue-spotted elder walks up, calmly saying that this one clearly never learned how to live when food and water run short. The elder quietly asks if they can stop for a bit, and Yuri, feeling the same weight in his own legs, admits he wants a break just as badly. Yuri lifts his head and shouts to the whole line that they are stopping to rest. One of the skull-masked guards repeats the order down the line, warning that it is only a short break as the marchers drop to the ground, panting with relief. Leaning on his staff, Yuri stares up the narrow trail and wonders if it truly leads to the rich place they were told about. And if his body can handle any more even after this pause, then he pushes the worry down and tells himself to at least enjoy this tiny rest, even though their bellies are still almost empty. He lifts his gaze to the bright gap between the cliffs, letting the silence soak in as he steadies his heart for the long climb still waiting above them. Yuri walks beside the worn-out traveler and points out that they have been pushing down this dry path for 3 days straight. He thinks about it again, 3 whole days of this heat and dust, and feels his patience wearing thin. As he trudges forward, Yuri knows the whole group is drained and their food bags are almost empty, with no clear way to refill them. He tells himself he cannot just wait for their god to save them again, when the skull-masked chief suddenly sprints over, shouting that some kind of new people are blocking the way ahead. Yuri and the weary tribesmen look up toward the front as a voice from the crowd shouts that the figures ahead are those small scaly foes they have clashed with before. The green traveler swallowed hard, trying to form words as he stared at the scaly warriors blocking the path. One of the skull-masked lizard men rubbed his face with a sigh, clearly not thrilled about dealing with more trouble after the hard climb. The worn-out traveler lifted his axe on reflex, teeth clenched, even though his arms were shaking from the march. A moment later, the axe slipped from his hand and hit the dry ground, his courage giving way to plain fear. He dropped to his knees in front of the lizardman warrior and started to stammer out an apology, his whole body shaking. He pointed to the simple roots they had been given, explaining that this small meal had saved them when they were ready to collapse in that canyon. The lizardman warriors traded a doubtful look and pressed him on why he had rushed out of the canyon, and the traveler blurted that they had to leave as fast as they could. Kneeling by the bundle of roots, the traveler admitted that they had left their home behind, grabbed what food they could carry, and wandered into the wilderness with no plan except to survive. The lizardman leader bared his teeth, stunned that they had really walked away from their homes just to wander the wasteland. The worn traveler raised a shaking arm toward the far hills, telling them that was where his people had once lived in peace. Those warm, rocky hills had given them just enough food and water to get by. Nothing fancy, but enough that no one went hungry. His voice grew tight as he admitted that everything had been fine until a monster appeared in those hills. The lizardman leader straightened, repeating the word monster under his breath as he weighed what kind of danger could drive a whole group from their land. Far above, Nebula leaned over his glowing screen, mulling over the word monster and already trying to guess what kind of creature had pushed weak travelers this. Down in a forgotten canyon, a giant many-legged insect sprawled over shattered stone faces and toppled walls, its twisted body wrapped around the ruins like it owned the place. The system tagged it as an ancient Coleoptera, a level 9 abomination with strength and brains far beyond anything his followers had faced, making it a threat Nebula could not ignore. In the old game story, the ancient gods once shaped twisted beasts like this giant centipede and left them roaming the ruined world. Even after those gods vanished, their creations never left, crawling across the land on their own with no one to control them. The traveler pointed down into the canyon, and the lizardmen followed his gaze, finally seeing the nightmare that had chased his people from the hills. Looking down that sheer drop at the armored centipede wrapped around broken stone and bones, Nebula remembered what players had called things like this: abominations. The system flagged its fangs as uniquely venomous and hinted at some forgotten god's blessing that even Nebula couldn't read. And he knew at a glance that his lizardmen stood no chance in a straight fight. From the cliff edge, the warriors stared at the thing sprawled over the cracked earth, its body so huge it filled the canyon like a living fortress. The abomination shifted its plated head, and the bones scattered around it rattled as the ground began to shake. The masked spear-bearers felt their weapons tremble in their hands as the earth shook, and panic crept into their eyes when they understood the beast was waking up. One of the warriors tried to laugh it off as the monster just wandering in its sleep, but his eyes were fixed on Lacrek, already asking if they should just run. Lacrek asked how much longer it would take to circle the whole mountain range, and the guide worked it out, saying that marching through the wilds instead would add about 8 days to their journey. Lacrek murmured that 8 days was a huge stretch of time, turning the number over in his head like it was another enemy to fight. Nebula watched Lacrek stall and did not blame him. Any leader would waver with their warriors shaking at the edge of that canyon. But stretching the march by more than a week in this wasteland would only drain their food and strength even further. With his followers staring down into the canyon, Nebula called out to Lacrek in his mind, pushing him toward a decision and asking what path he would choose. Lacrek traded a long look with his fellow warrior, and in that brief silence his doubt hardened into resolve. The cliff rose before them like a wall of baked stone, making it clear that there was no easy path around this place. One of the scouts stood right at the drop, peering into the depths and waiting for Lacrek's word on whether they would risk going down or turn back. The cliff towered over them, huge boulders hanging above like they could roll down at any time. One of the younger warriors stepped close to Lacrek, calling to his chief with a look that said he was ready to fight. Zayal, a warrior who also served as a mediator, told Lacrek that right now their strength, minds, and even their knack for talking gave them the upper hand. Lacrek stared out over the canyon, repeating Zayal's words like he could not quite believe they were the ones with the advantage, while the green-skinned ally watched him tensely. As the wind rushed between the cliffs, Zayal reminded his chief of something the tribe's blacksmith had done not long ago. Sitting with his warriors, Lacrek slowly nodded as he remembered the blacksmith using some odd tool to make the fire burn hotter. In his mind, the chief could see the bellows again, that plain-looking tool that pushed more air through the coals and made the fire roar without wearing the blacksmith out. Lacrek rubbed his chin, weighing the idea, and started to see how they might use their small edge here the same way the blacksmith used that tool. Zayal agrees that the bellows let them work faster, and adds that some clever craftsman had spent a long time thinking to make it. Lacrek looks out over the canyon and decides they do not need the same level of careful thought as that craftsman. He plans to copy the idea in a much simpler way, using the boulders above the canyon as a single, huge tool to crush the monster below. High above the canyon, the massive boulder began to shake on the cliff edge, ready to be turned into their giant hammer. Stone dust spilled and small rocks tumbled as the boulder slowly ground forward, the cliff starting to give way under its weight. The huge stone lurched, breaking free bit by bit, and loose chunks bounced into the open air below. Below the cliff, Lacrek and his warriors heaved on the long wooden beam, matching their breaths as they drove the lever down to force the boulder forward. The thick logs slammed into the ground, their weight and speed turning the rough frame into a single, brutal push against the stone. The masked warriors shifted their grips and followed the call, releasing together and then dragging the beams back up to ready the next shove. Working in pairs along the cliff, the lizardmen drove two great levers in rhythm, inching the boulders toward the edge as the giant centipede writhed helplessly below. From his dark, star-filled throne, Nebula watched the images of the levers and rolling stones, and quietly noted how this rough copy of a bellows turned into a clean, efficient way to crush the abomination. The abomination crawled through the canyon, its shell like a moving fortress, and any normal hunt would have ended here. High above, the boulders trembled on the cliff edge, and their only real chance was to send every last one crashing down at the same time. Lacrek bared his teeth and drove his warriors on, ordering them to shove the beam harder and start the count. On the second beat, they dropped their weight together, claws digging into the wood as the lever slammed toward the ground. The beam kicked up with a crack, and one of the huge stones lurched free and tumbled over the cliff. The lever shot forward harder than they expected, and Lacrek and the warrior beside him clung on, startled by how far it had gone. One after another, the boulders roared down the canyon wall toward the abomination, and the huge creature threw up its claws as the shadow of the falling stones swallowed it. Catching his breath, Lacrek stepped to the edge with his warriors and stared down into the dust, wondering if the avalanche had finally taken the abomination out. Far above the canyon, the nameless god lowered the bone mask over its face, finally choosing to act. The abomination burst out of the dust, screeching as it forced its huge body upward. One of Lacrek's warriors cried out in panic as the creature started climbing the cliff toward them, stone tower and all. One of the masked warriors peered over the edge, confused as the air itself seemed to thrum beneath his claws. More stones crashed down, but the creature was already too high on the wall, its legs digging in as it clawed its way toward the ledge. Blue light wrapped around Lacrek's body, and he dug in his claws and caught the rolling boulder, holding the impossible weight in place as if the god's strength had poured straight into him. Lacrek threw out his hand, telling the warriors on the beam to pull back, because more rocks would only get them crushed along with the beast. Out in the blue void, the nameless god stepped forward, cloak glittering like the night sky, answering his followers' danger with a true descent. The god hurled himself down like a falling star, blue light streaking in his wake. Lacrek stared up into the rain of light, realizing that his god was coming in person. Lacrek's muscles swelled under the blue glow, every scale pulled tight as he forced his body to hold the power pouring into him. He threw himself at the boulder and shoved with both hands, blue light bursting out as he tried to hurl the massive stone back into the canyon. Up on the cliff, the warriors finally sent the last boulders crashing down, knowing all they could do now was watch and hope the rockfall was enough to break the crawling abomination. Lacrek did not trust the stones alone, gripping his spear as the blue light wrapped tighter around him, ready to throw himself straight at the monster. Then the chief kicked off the rock and shot into the sky like a blue comet, leaving the warriors on the ledge staring up in shock. High above the canyon, Lacrek raised his spear toward the blazing light, gathering every drop of the god's power into one strike meant to finish the beast. The rocks lifted for a heartbeat, and then Lacrek dropped with them in a blinding blue pillar, driving straight through stone and shell as if the god himself had slammed into the abomination. The giant shell-backed creature let out a broken scream, its legs flailing for a moment before its whole body sagged in the dust, crushed by the strike. The abomination smashed into the ground, its shell cracking under the blue blast as dust and rocks burst outward. The giant bug tried to lift its body, only for more boulders to slam onto its back and drive it down again. On the cliff, the lizardman chief and his warrior leaned over the edge, staring down to see if the monster was finally done. Lacrek dropped to the canyon floor in a low crouch, blue light fading off his scales as he faced the place where the abomination had fallen. The abomination's huge body toppled and crashed in front of him, legs twitching weakly as broken stone slid off its shell. Far away, Nebula lounged in the blue void, watching the glowing screens of Lacrek and the others, and calmly noting that the hunt had gone just the way he wanted. Down in the canyon, Lacrek stood beside the monster's long, twisted body, its many legs limp and its shell cracked open across the dust. The system announced that an abomination had been hunted, marking that Nebula's believers had taken down the ancient Koloptera and earned their reward. On the cliff above the canyon, the lizardmen warriors roared and thrust their spears into the sky, drunk on the rush of finally bringing the abomination down. Nebula watched the notice about his growing faith with calm interest, but his attention locked on the new reward window. A small pouch icon shimmered, and in his hand a red core of energy formed, the abomination's essence that had made this whole hunt worth the effort. The system unfolded the essence's profile, showing a small flame-shaped beast with basic stats, and the promise that with enough growth it could rise into powerful roles like Apostle or even Incarnation. Leaning back with a hand on his chin, Nebula compared every detail to his memories of Lost World, wondering if the creature crafting system here would let him break this world the same way he broke the game. Lacrek and his warriors circled the abomination's huge body, staring at the thick shell and claws, already thinking about what they could turn this monster into. Lacrek hefted one of the lost legs and wondered aloud if they could eat this thing, while the warriors beside him flinched at the foul stench leaking out. To make sure, the chief bit straight into the leg, tearing off a chunk of meat despite the slimy juice running down the shell. After forcing it down, Lacrek turned his back on the corpse and told them the meat was not fit to eat like this, saying it tasted worse than anything he had tried before. One of the warriors poked at a strip of the pale flesh and admitted it was awful, but guessed the real issue was that they were trying to eat it as it was. Lacrek rubbed his chin and suggested that if the meat alone was no good, they should try mixing it with other things instead of giving up on it. The chief talked about gathering strong-smelling plants nearby and roasting the monster meat with them over a fire so the herb scent would cover the stink. Soon a warrior peeled steaming shreds of meat from the shell, now covered with fresh leaves and smelling far better than the raw monster ever had. Lacrek raised a small shred of the roasted meat to his mouth, studying it carefully before taking a bite. Lacrek pointed at the dish on the leaf and told the warrior he had made the meat edible by cooking it, while the other lizardman repeated the strange word, still trying to grasp what it meant. The chief explained that he had covered the meat with good-smelling grass and roasted the whole thing over a fire. Lacrek admitted he had almost thrown the monster away after tasting it raw, but now, cooked like this, it was more than good enough, and one of the warriors quickly asked him to teach this new skill. Lacrek agreed without hesitation, ready to show the others how to do it. Strong hands pulled apart the steaming flesh, getting ready to share the monster meat that no longer smelled like garbage. With the warm meat in his hands, Lacrek faced the younger warrior, ready to share both the food and the lessons that came with it. Lacrek sank his teeth into the chunk with a heavy bite, proving to the others that this once useless monster had just become their next meal. Lacrek froze for a moment, clearly thrown off by what he just heard. Zayal reminded him that they were not young anymore, and said that finding partners would be important if they wanted their new home to last. The chief rubbed his chin, repeating the word in his head as if it were strange, and a small bead of sweat slid down his face. Zayal said that if Lacrek had never really thought about choosing anyone, he could always consider him instead. Lacrek sat there with his hand over his mouth, stuck between surprise and thought, and let the silence stretch. Chief drew in a slow breath, his jaw working as he tried to form an answer. Zayal turned his head puzzled, as Lacrek suddenly told him that something was right behind him. Among the broken stone blocks, a golden slab was shining with an eerie light, its surface packed with tiny carved marks. The thing hidden in the rubble turned out to be a thick golden slab, covered in tiny carvings and pictures that caught the light like fire. One of the lizardmen explained that the slab had been fixed to the monster's back like some kind of armor, and the others just stared at it, amazed by the thought. Lacrek hefted the weight of it, while the green-spotted elder said it was not something they could eat at all, but a metal humans called gold. The elder said he had seen this metal once before, when a human blacksmith proudly showed him different kinds of ore and bars. He explained that when polished, this metal throws back the light and gleams, and since it never rusts or fades, humans treat it as something very precious. Lacrek frowned at the heavy plate, grumbling that a metal they could not eat or shape easily was no help, and said they would be better off chasing real prey instead. One of the horned hunters brightened as he talked about deer with branch-like horns and sweet meat, adding that the orcs had just spotted a herd nearby, and that he would go ask them about it right away. As the others talked about the hunt, Lacrek stayed behind, gazing at the golden slab in his hands and wondering how something so useless for eating could still matter to their new world. One of the hunters asked if Lacrek was coming too, but the chief just said he had eaten enough and told them to go without him, keeping the golden slab close as if he still had more to think about. Staring at the carvings, Lacrek slowly understood that this metal was different, because it simply did not rot or fade like anything else. Watching blood run down the rock from the deer they had just brought down, Lacrek thought about how every body, every tree, and even every stone would someday break apart. Yet the slab in his hand stayed bright and whole, as if time itself could not touch it. From that thought he guessed that the ones who made this slab must have wanted it to stay whole on purpose, and he found himself wondering what was so important that they needed it to outlast everything else. Zayal walked up and told Lacrek that everyone back at the resting place was settled in for the night, pulling the chief out of his thoughts. Lacrek mentioned that he had not told anyone about this place, and asked Zayal how he had managed to find him out here among the rocks and trees. Zayal admitted he had just scanned the camp for fur-lined clothes, knowing Lacrek was the only one who wore such a thing. When Lacrek pointed out that Zayal had been the one to insist on the fur in the first place, Zayal simply said he had chosen it for him because he was the chief, and deserved something that set him apart. Zayal watched the sunrise and called to his chief, hearing in his voice that Lacrek still had not let go of whatever he was thinking about. Holding the golden slab close, Lacrek decided their resting place needed its own mark, a single sign that would stand for them long after they were gone. As he stared at the stone, bright lines of light floated up and twisted into strange shapes, and Lacrek froze, wondering what this sign was that had just appeared before him. Lacrek did not care if the shining lines were real or not. Their path was the same as the cuts on the golden slab, and he understood that what truly lasted was the shape itself, a symbol that could not be worn away. Deciding that the idea behind the mark was what needed to stay pure, the chief knelt and carefully pressed the shape into the earth, giving form to the sign that would stand for his people. By the time the sky turned pink, Lacrek lay back on the grass, then called softly for Zayal, ready to show at least one other person what he had made. Zayal hurried over, asking what was going on, and Lacrek told him there was something he needed to see, his tone making it clear this was no small matter. With the tip of his stick, the chief traced the same sharp shape into the ground and told Zayal that this mark would stand for him. Lacrek taps the first mark in the dirt and calmly explains that this one stands for male lizardman, starting to turn his thoughts into clear rules Zayal can follow. The chief draws a new shape beside the first and tells Zayal that this mark is hers, tying the strange lines on the ground to the people sitting right there. Sitting close, Lacrack goes on to say that just like the first mark, this second one will stand for a female lizardman, and Zayal studies it with quiet focus. With a small smile, the chief drags his stick between the two marks, hinting that together they can say more than they do alone. Soon the pattern is clear on the ground. The mark for a male, 2 short strokes, and the mark for a female, forming the first simple line that says something about them together. Zayal stares at the joined symbols, her bright eyes narrowing as she asks Lacrack what this new line between them is supposed to say. Lacrack meets her gaze with a soft, knowing look, taking a breath as if weighing how to put something important into simple words. Pointing at the full pattern, Lacrack finally explains that it means the 2 marked lizardmen belong together, a simple line on the ground saying they are each other's companions. Lacrack looks straight at Zayal and says that this mark is not just a lesson. It is also his answer to the proposal she made to him before. Their hands close together on the stick, a small touch that turns the simple drawing in the dirt into a promise between them. Lacrack slowly draws a circle around the 2 joined marks, as if setting their bond apart from the rest of the world. The chief lowers his head, his voice softer now as he asks Lacrack if he really understands what this mark and this promise will mean for both of them. Lacrack looks out at the glowing sky and answers that he understands, then sits shoulder to shoulder with Zayal as their tails curl together, while a blue butterfly rests on the sacred stone below, as if blessing their choice. Nebula turned his gaze from their quiet promise to the forest, watching one of his lizardmen stalk a herd of deer, the start of the next important event. The lead hunter dropped from above and slammed into the biggest deer, while the others charged in after him, turning the forest into a wild race for the best catch. When he raised the deer above his head and the tribe roared in joy, it was more than a good hunt. It was his way of asking to stand beside his chosen partner. Afterward, the hunters bumped forearms and laughed, the shared victory tying them closer as they joked about who had almost stolen the prize. The victor's grin faded as a tribesman tugged at him, and his eyes sharpened, sensing that this hunt had just led to something bigger. Under the hanging net full of live game, the chief studied the catch with calm eyes, already thinking about how this would help raise strong children for the next generation. When Nebula's huge blue form flickered into view above them, he let out a sharp curse, suddenly aware that this joyful wedding hunt was about to drag his fragile tribe into real danger. Far away, sunlit cliffs rose over a dry land, the quiet sky hiding the trouble that was already starting to move there. Standing among the broken pieces of the monster's body, the hunter looked over the empty canyon and wondered if taking this place as their own was really the right choice. Lacrack waved it off, saying they would have had to deal with that monster sooner or later, so no one owed him anything for it. The orc chief, still unsure if this was too generous, told Lacrack that this had once been his people's land and urged him to just move back in like before. As the offer sank in, the orc chief's eyes filled with tears, his face flushing as the weight of getting his home back finally hit him. The orc chief bent his whole body in a deep bow before Lacrack, pouring out his thanks over and over for saving his people and giving them a future here. Wiping his eyes, the orc chief straightened up and proudly pointed to the younger orc beside him, explaining that this was his son and the one who would inherit his place in the tribe. The orc chief went on to say that his son knew every path and cliff around this place better than anyone, and suggested that the boy could guide Lacrack's group safely through the area. Beyond the cliffs stretched a thick green forest and distant peaks, and the chief warned that up ahead the land crawled with wild beasts and tribes far larger than Lacrack's own. The orc chief said that with Lacrack's group watching over him, his son would be safe on the road. Lacrack stayed quiet as the chief promised they would never forget what he had done for their tribe. The forest ahead looked peaceful and bright, hiding the dangers and strangers waiting inside it. As they moved into the trees, a scout shouted for the chief, saying they had found something unusual. In the grass lay a set of wide, 3-toed prints, clear enough to show that something large and upright had passed through. Lacrack crouched beside the marks and ran his claws along the shapes, checking their size while the blue lizardman waited nervously behind him. Lacrack asked the blue lizardman if he recognized the footprints, and the local nodded, saying he was pretty sure he did. The blue lizardman explained that these tracks were left by frogs that walked on 2 legs, the kind that people called frogmen. Lacrack lifted his head, repeating the word frogman in his mind, already weighing what that meant for his people. He thought about the frogmen the scout had heard of, a race that walked on 2 legs like them, some friendly, some cruel, and smart enough to speak and plan. The guide guessed the frogmen were scouting for something, maybe even caught up in a war, and Lacrack frowned, knowing any nearby fight could spill straight onto his tribe. Looking over the grass, he counted at least 5 sets of wide, 3-toed prints, and noted that each one belonged to something even bigger than a grown lizardman. Lacrack straightened up and ended the search, telling the others they would fall back to their temporary camp before the frogmen noticed them. By nightfall, the patrol was back among the leaf tents, the camp glowing with torchlight as the tribe waited to hear what their chief had decided. Nif told everyone to push house building as fast as they could, and when a younger lizardman asked why, Ms. Zayal explained that a forest full of huts would make any enemy think their numbers were far greater. They agreed to gather more scouts and guards, warning that everyone would need to pull their weight, and as one warrior hurried off Ms. Zayal quietly admitted she was sure the frogmen were already watching their every move. The leaf tents glowed softly in the dark forest, their fires the only light for miles. From a distant ridge, a pair of lizardmen watched the camp, guarding it until dawn and waiting for any sign of frogmen that never came. Days passed in their new home, and still no frogmen showed themselves, giving the tribe a rare stretch of peace to breathe and plan. Above it all, Nebula checked the system and saw how many early goals his lizardmen had already hit, realizing no other player had stabilized their people as fast as he had. Cattle grazed calmly nearby, while the lizardmen hauled beams and fixed roofs, turning rough shelters into sturdy houses shaped for the swampy forest around them. On a flat stone, new marks and lines began to appear, as the tribe slowly turned old hunting signs into a true written language. Hunters gathered around the carved rock, using its mix of trail signs and letters as a rough map, and those who had learned to read pointed things out so the rest could pick it up too. Under Lacrak's orders, each worker scratched their own harvest onto the stone beside their goods, so the tribe could finally see in clear marks who brought in what each day. One lizardman stared at the marks, pleased to see he had gathered more than most, while the one beside him frowned at his own line and silently promised to push himself harder tomorrow. Nebula watched his growing tribe from above, and for a moment allowed himself to feel satisfied, thinking that everything was finally moving the way he wanted. Across the continent, the locust swarms thickened and spread, and near his lands Nebula quietly guided 3 of them, stripping grass here and there to nudge herds and travelers without anyone guessing a god was behind it. Even while he watched the sun wash the forest in warm light, Nebula knew this was just the opening act, and that the next turn on this land's path would bring the worst danger his followers had faced yet. Down in the village, the lizardmen just talked and rested in the sun, busy with small worries and not yet sensing that anything in their world was about to change. The peace snapped when a tribesman rushed in, shouting for the chief, and every head turned toward Lacrak at once. Breathless and sweating, the messenger blurted out that something had gone terribly wrong, and Lacrak's easy stance tightened as he braced for the details. When he heard that the frogmen had begun to move, Lacrak's calm expression hardened, knowing at once that this could only mean trouble for the tribe. Out in the forest, a green webbed foot pressed into the dirt as the first frogmen stepped forward, their quiet march toward the lizardmen's new home finally beginning. The frogmen finally stepped into full view, lined up like they were here for a meeting instead of a raid, their leader in the middle wearing bright red feathers and watching the lizardmen with steady eyes. Across the clearing, the black-scaled chief and his warriors stood firm, saying nothing yet, just weighing these strangers who had walked straight into their new home. The lizardman leader quickly pegged the newcomers as frogmen, but then his gaze caught on something wrong in the middle of their ranks, where a thin gray lizardman stood among them like part of their party. Lone lizardman at their side moved with easy steps and a travel bag over his shoulder, close enough to brush against green arms, and the chief could not tell if he was a guest, a guide, or proof that the frogmen had already won someone over. Both sides stepped into the open, frogmen in bright cloth and feathers facing lizardmen in dark hides and bone helms. Spears were ready on one side, calm hands on the other, and everyone waited to see if this meeting would turn into a fight. The frogman in the red feathers stepped forward with an easy smile and proudly introduced himself as Shunan, son of the great chief Aloy. Still smiling, Shunan called out to the lizardmen and made it clear he had not come to fight them, stressing that his group carried no hostile intent. Lacrak lifted a hand to calm his warriors, and watching the frogman's polite stance, decided this visitor at least knew how to show proper respect. The black-scaled chief gave his own name as Lacrak, and stated that his people also had no wish to raise their weapons today. With the greetings out of the way, Lacrak's eyes narrowed a little as he asked what business had brought Shunan and his people all the way here. Shunan traded a quick look with the heavy-set frogman at his side, as if checking that they were agreed on what to say next. Then the frogman chief explained that his group had crossed into black-scale land and had come to state that openly, watching Lacrak closely to see how the lizardman leader handled trespassers. Lacrak calmly points out that no single tribe could own all this land, and adds that his guests never passed any clear border marks when they first came in. After saying that, the black-scaled chief admits that without those marks, the frogmen really could not have known they were crossing into his land. Shunan lowers his head a little, and gives a simple apology for stepping into black-scaled territory without knowing. Lacrak waves off the mistake and explains that his party has traveled from very far away, has no home for now, and wishes to stay in this place to rest. One of the frogmen stares at Lacrak in surprise, whispering Shunan's full title as the son of the great chief Aloy, and the group suddenly understands how important this visitor is. Lacrak smiles and says that as the chief's son, Shunan is exactly the kind of person who can choose to show them kindness here. Shunan breaks into a wide grin and answers that he does have that power, promising that, as heir to his tribe, he can let them rest here by his own choice. As the frogmen cheer at Shunan's answer, it becomes clear what Lacrak's group really is. Trusted guards the great chief sent to keep his son safe on this journey. Lacrak watches him closely, weighing every move. Shunan admits he still has a lot he wants to ask, but decides to save it for later. Suggests they should where his group can celebrate that fact together. Shunan thanks him for the invitation, but says heading into the village right now would not be wise. Shunan explains that, even if he means no harm, taking a group of armed strangers into his village without real trust would be hard. Lacrak accepts that, but says his people refuse to let someone who treated them kindly walk away with nothing. The lizardman chief suggests they just stay here and share a meal together instead. Shunan glances at his escort, then gives a hesitant nod, agreeing that this much should be fine. Before long, fresh meat turns golden over the fire, the smell of roasting fat filling the clearing. Lacrak and Shunan sit facing each other by the fire, trading words while their followers stand watch. With the meat crackling between them, the sharp edge of their meeting finally starts to soften. Shunan watches the lizardmen and frogmen mix together and tries to guess how close they really are. He wants to know why these two races live side by side and what they are planning, but he forces himself to act casual. If he shows how curious he is now, he knows they might twist it to their advantage. To break the ice, Shunin points at the bright red feathers around the Frogman Chief's neck and asks what they are for. The Frogman laughs lightly, happy to talk about them. The Frogman Chief proudly strokes one of the feathers and explains that they were taken from a beast called a cacatris. Shunin repeats the strange name under his breath, trying to picture what kind of monster it might be. The Frogman Chief goes on to explain that cacatrices are huge birds that run on two legs and stalk the forests around this place, and that they are known as very dangerous creatures. In Shunin's mind, the creature takes shape. A massive bird with bright wings, sharp claws, and venom that makes it hard for even lizardmen to bring down. The Frogman Chief adds that the cacatrices are quick on their feet, claim wide hunting grounds, and have even been roaming close to this very area. Hearing how hard the beasts are to catch, Shunin guesses they must rely on simple javelins, but the Frogman only gives a sly smile, as if to say his people have a few other tricks. The Lizardman Chief tilts his head, puzzled but interested by the Frogman's promise to show him the beast for real. The Frogman Chief suddenly jumps up, bragging that he will just show them, and loudly orders someone to bring his bow and arrows. The Frogman Chief calls out to Owen, saying that since he is free anyway, he should go grab the bow and arrows, and Owen quickly agrees. The Lizardman Chief leans back and watches quietly, wondering what he can learn from the way the Frogman handles his people. Owen returns with the bow and a bundle of arrows, and the Frogman Chief thanks him before saying he still needs one more favor. The Frogman Chief points at a tree nearby and asks Owen to fix a good wooden plank there so he can practice his archery, and Owen agrees without complaint. The Lizardman Chief silently follows Owen with his eyes as the gray lizardman walks over to the tree, plank in hand, getting the target ready. An arrow whistles across the clearing and slams straight into the center of the wooden plank, showing that the Frogman's talk about hunting cacatrices was not just bragging. The Frogman Chief agrees without fuss and carefully passes the bow over. The Lizardman Chief takes it with both hands, already thinking about how it works. The Lizardman Chief fumbles a bit as he grips the bow and string, feeling how strange it is compared to a spear. The Frogman warns him that using it well will be tough at first. As he pulls the string back, the Lizardman feels the bow fight against him, the wood and cord far tougher than they look. The raw force packed into this simple shape surprises him. He lets the string snap forward and the arrow whips away, lighter than a thrown spear. He weighs it in his mind, seeing that even if each shot hits softer than a javelin, you can carry many of them and hit faster and truer from far away. The new arrow bites into the grass well before the plank, nowhere near the Frogman's clean hit. The gap between the two shots shows just how much practice this weapon will demand from his people. The Lizardman Chief glances at the bow, tempted to bring one back and pull it apart until he understands every piece. He reins that urge in for now, knowing that grabbing their weapon too soon could shake the fragile trust he is building with this tribe. Most of the Lizardman Chief's arrows lie in the grass, with only one barely holding onto the plank, showing just how far he is from matching the Frogman's aim. The Frogman archer laughs off the poor shot as normal for a first try, then turns to tease Owen for just standing there instead of gathering the arrows. Owen hurries over the grass toward the target, ready to gather the arrows the chief just fired. Lizardman Chief turns away from the bow with clear reluctance, telling himself to let it go for now, even though he still wants to learn every detail about that strange weapon. Kneeling in the tall grass, Owen gathers the fallen arrows one by one while the chief steps up beside him, his presence looming over the smaller lizardman. The chief crouches down beside him and calmly checks that his name is Owen, and the younger lizardman stiffens, stammering as he tries to answer. Noticing how badly Owen is rattled, the chief calmly asks why a lizardman like him is living among frogmen, and Owen hesitates, sweat running down his neck as he struggles to explain. As they gather the fallen arrows, Owen quietly explains that even though they are different races, the lizardmen and frogmen live together in one village. The chief studies him with a calm, sharp look and asks why the two races would choose to live like that. Owen answers that they share the village because each race covers what the other lacks, so living together makes life easier for both sides. The chief turns toward him, a little surprised, and asks if they really help each other like that. Owen beams and says that is exactly how it is, adding that this give and take is why the lizardmen and frogmen get along so well. The chief listens with a calm, heavy gaze, turning Owen's words about shared work and safety over in his mind. By the fire, frogmen and lizardmen relax together, the lizardmen handling the roasting while the tall frogman stands watch. A quiet picture of how food and protection are traded here. The chief points out that strong lizardmen like them should not have to hide behind frogmen, but Owen clings to his belief, saying this forest would swallow them without the huge frog tribe that rules it. Owen forces a small smile and admits that without their frog protectors, his people would barely scrape by at all. The chief quickly decides this talk is too risky and tells Owen to forget it ever happened, saying that if anyone asks, he was only asking simple questions about archery. Soon a slab of roasted meat, shiny with fat and laid neatly on broad leaves, is set out to be shared. The frogman tears into a rib and his eyes light up as he chews, clearly surprised by how good the lizardman's cooking is. The frogman laughs and says he is used to plain game, but this meat with scented herbs is on a different level. And the chief, chewing his own piece in the back, answers that he is happy their guest enjoys it. The frog chief almost bounces in place at the mention of water buffalo meat, clutching his plate like treasure. The lizardman chief answers calmly that he has tasted it before, even when the meat was not fresh, and it was still amazing. When he hears they keep live water buffalo back in the village, the frog chief freezes for beat, already counting how much that herd could be worth. The lizardman chief suggests they could swap some of those live beasts for bows, as if it were a casual idea. The frog chief presses in with a blush of greed, agreeing right away like it is the best offer he has heard all year. Then the image of his own tribe's power hangs over him, and the frog chief's smile dies as sweat runs down his face. He quickly backpedals, saying that trading bows for such valuable animals might not be such a smart deal after all. The lizardman chief keeps chewing, watching the frog chief with half-lidded eyes, and quietly accepts that this tribe is not ready to trade something that big yet. The frog chief forces the mood back to easy talk, saying they can leave deals for later and first just get to know each other as neighbors. He goes on to explain that his tribe does not treat lizardmen as enemies at all, pointing out Owen as proof that a lizardman can live safely among them. Round them, frogmen and lizardmen sit in an easy circle, talking like old friends instead of guards and guests. The frog chief explains that this calm is normal in his home because both races already live side by side in his village. The lizardman envoy twitched his tail and turned, ears pricking as someone called out to Owen. The frog chief beamed and threw an arm around Owen, asking him to lay out how much both sides had gained since joining forces. The envoy bent forward with a toothy grin, saying he was happy to share the numbers if it helped grow trust between them. The lizardman chief watched quietly, thinking how neatly the frogs had slipped that request into the talk, like it was planned from the start. Because he had spoken with the envoy beforehand, he knew this smile was just part of the act and not blind trust. As the sun dipped over the forest, one of the leaders said that this had been a good meeting, and no one seemed to disagree. The frog chief cheerfully suggested they visit his village next time instead of making his people walk so far, but the lizardman chief turned him down, saying this open clearing was safer since nothing blocked their view. With the sky turning orange, the frog chief lifted his arm in a wide wave, calling out a bright farewell before leading his people. The lizardman chief and his warriors raised their hands in return, sending the frogs off with calm smiles, while each of them weighed what this new tie might really mean. Once the others were out of earshot, the frog chief yanked the envoy close, his grip rough instead of friendly. The lizardman's eye filled with tears, finally showing how much he feared this so-called partner. From the edge of the clearing, the lizardman chief asked his companion if he had caught that moment. The warrior answered that he had, eyes fixed on the frogs. As the frogs headed back toward the trees, the chief kept his arm locked around the gray lizardman like a leash. Watching them go, the lizardman agreed that this was no healthy bond at all. Back near the village, the frog chief suddenly swung his arm and smashed the envoy to the ground. He roared at the cowering lizardman, furious that the envoy thought he could hide anything from him. The envoy clutched his aching cheek, sweat running down his snout as the chief pressed him about his talk with the lizardman leader. Words tumbled out as he tried to explain himself. Bowing so low his snout nearly touched the grass, the envoy insisted he had not given the lizardman chief any real information. He begged them to believe he had stayed loyal. Shaking, the lizardman blurted that the chief had only asked how to become better with a bow, and he had just answered that simple question. He clung to that tiny detail like it could save his skin. The burly toad warrior stepped in and drove the envoy back into the dirt, scoffing that such an excuse made no sense when the lizardman could not even shoot a bow. Beside him, the frog chief watched coldly as their frightened servant writhed at their feet. On his knees in the grass, the gray lizardman stammered that claiming he could shoot made him look less suspicious. He hunched low, hoping that tiny bit of logic would calm the frog chief towering over him. The frog chief tapped his snout and slowly agreed that the excuse did make sense. The envoy rushed on, saying he had refused to teach the lizardman chief, and had even demanded payment if the chief really wanted lessons. The frog chief leaned in and asked how the lizardman chief had answered. Shaking on the ground, the envoy explained that the chief just said he owned nothing of value and then walked away. The frog chief traded a look with his warrior, a slow grin forming as he decided the story checked out. As the village lights flickered behind them, the frog chief laughed and called Owen a clever trader, teasing him for trying to squeeze payment out of his own chief. The frog chief looked down at him and called his name, and Owen straightened up fast, answering with a shaky respect. Smiling warmly now, the frog chief asked if Owen still remembered what waited on that island, turning the talk from punishment to something far more important. Owen squeezed his eyes shut, his face burning as sweat slid down his cheek, trying to hold himself together while the frog chief talked about his son. Across the water, the island camp glowed in the sunset, while Owen crouched alone at the shore, staring at the place where his child had almost been taken. The frog chief told Owen that his son had been next in line to be offered up, but other children had shown up just in time, leaving the boy huddled in the tent with the rest of the captives. The frog chief leaned in with a wide grin, calling it pure luck and making Owen nod along, even though the thought of it made Owen's face burn. Owen's eye hardened as he decided this narrow escape was nothing less than a miracle meant for him. He pushed himself to his feet, and voice shaking but loud swore he would fool the lizardman in any way he could if it meant keeping his boy safe. Later that night, under the full moon, Owen sat by the water and cursed himself, thinking that if he had known it would turn out like this, he never would have led his people here from so far away. He replayed every hint he had ignored, from being sent to that island to the so-called brotherly ritual for their warriors, and knew now that the 200 lizardmen left did not dare stand against the 1,500 frogmen holding their lives. Their so-called god towered over them, twin jaws wide and glowing eyes burning down on the crowd. The lizardmen below could only stare up in terror, knowing this monster was the reason no one dared to resist. Owen knew the frogmen were not just bullies with numbers, they had a god watching over them. With that kind of backing, they could act like they were born to rule over every lizardman on that island. He admitted the black-scaled chief looked strong enough to stand even against that monster, But in the end, that chief only led about 600 warriors, far fewer than the frogmen could throw at them. The lizardman by the lake crossed his arms and told himself the black scales were just savages who did not even know how to use bows. If a tribe like that was thrown into the fire first, his own people might last a little longer. His gaze lingered on the small body curled up among the other children, and his chest tightened. Staring across the water at the island camp, Owen promised his son that he would bring every last lizardman here if that was what it took for the boy to survive. By daylight, a sturdy water buffalo stood tied beside a black-scale warrior, its hide shining in the sun. This living prize was the hook they had brought to tempt the frogmen into it. The frog chief's eyes lit up like stars the moment he saw the animal, his whole body shaking with delight. To him, a live water buffalo was proof that this trade was worth any price. Black-scaled chief smiled, hand resting on the buffalo's neck, and reminded the frogmen that he had brought exactly what he promised. With that, he pressed them to hand over a bow in exchange, nudging the first piece of his plan into place. The frog chief rubbed his chin, suddenly less eager to hand over a weapon. He said a bow was a big favor and that before trading tools like that, they should at least get to know each other better. The frog chief pointed out that they knew nothing about the black-scaled tribe at all. He suggested they invite the frogmen to their village for a proper look around before any real weapon trade happened. The lizardman envoy smiled wide and said they could even lend a bow as a friendly gift. He called it the perfect chance for both sides to grow closer, as long as the black scales opened their village to the frogmen. The arrow cut through the air like a dart of light, flying far straighter and faster than anything their own bows could manage. The shaft buried itself deep in the far side of the field, and the black scale warriors in the distance traded looks, knowing their own bows had never reached that far. Watching the distant arrow, the black scale leader admitted that even after all their work, the frogman bows still sent arrows farther than anything his people could build. He ran his claws along the smooth curve of the bow, sure they had copied every part they understood, but still bothered by the one secret they lacked. Whatever strange beast the frogmen used for their bowstrings. With his eyes on the trees beyond the field, the leader noted that their fifth meeting with the frogmen was close, and that the other side seemed eager to learn more about the black scales. He spoke calmly, saying that all this talk of friendship felt like a cover, and that the frogmen were clearly planning something against them. The lone arrow stuck in the grass marked how far the frogmen could reach, and the leader decided that until they learned the trick, everyone would treat each deal with full caution. He tightened his grip on the bow and said this next meeting had to change something, then asked if they had gathered more of the herb that soothed the frogmen's itching sickness, relaxing only when his aide reported a rich patch nearby. The black-scaled chief stared toward the frogmen lands, quietly admitting that Owen might be the key they needed to break this stalemate. His eyes narrowed as he turned the idea over, then he decided it was time to test that hope instead of just waiting. One of the black-scale officers stepped forward with a report in hand, suggesting they meet Owen directly and give him a real chance to earn their trust. The chief mulled it over, knowing that one chance could either win them a vital ally or open the door to a trap. Far away in the frogman village, a lizardman twisted in pain from the itching sickness, furious that all the talk of cures had brought nothing to his people yet. The frogman leader ordered his brute to ease up before the captive broke, and the gasping lizardman, still shaking from the pain, muttered that the black-scaled chief was far more careful than they had guessed. The hulking frogman chuckled that the black scales were nothing like the fools in his own camp, then flung the trembling lizardman aside with orders to crawl out of his sight. Later, the frogman leader turned to Shunan and calmly told him to take charge of the battered lizardman, and Shunan agreed without a word of protest. Shunan leaned in and told Owen to move fast, warning that his father had already ordered the live sacrifice to happen sooner than planned. Owen replayed Shunan's command in his head, squeeze every bit of information from the black scales, then somehow bring their chief and warriors into this village no matter what it took. He wondered why the ceremony suddenly had to be rushed and guessed there was some secret only the frogmen shared, something he needed to hear himself. Shunan had said his father and the elders were getting worse, and that they could not delay any longer. The lizardman's spy swallowed hard and asked if the sickness they were talking about was the itchiness he had heard whispers of, and if it was truly that deadly. Inside the hall, the gathered frogmen shifted uneasily at the question, their faces tight with worry. Shunan admitted that this was knowledge the lizardmen were never meant to hear, then added that Owen was different enough that he could be told the truth. Shunan went on to explain that the itchiness was far worse than its name, starting as a simple itch before a sticky white slime crept over the skin. No matter how hard you scratched, it never went away and the slime just kept spreading. In time, it even choked your breathing, turning an annoyance into a slow, inescapable threat. He said that once it reached that stage, the victim simply did not make it, and even a respected priest had just fallen to the itchy disease the day before. The frogmen around the collapsed body could only stare, knowing their own turn might come next. Hearing that an itch could wipe people out left Owen reeling, and he questioned why Shunan would reveal such a weakness to someone from another race. He decided the frogman heir had to be testing him, and told himself to keep his face steady, no matter how shocked or secretly hopeful he felt. Across from him, Shunan's grave expression made it clear this was not something shared lightly. Shunan stressed that word of the sickness could never reach the battle-hungry lizardmen, or they would smell weakness and come for the frogmen at once. He added that the truth would leak out sooner or later, while Owen bowed low, fighting to keep any hint of excitement off his face. Shunan calmly says that even if word of the itchy disease leaks, they can still keep the lizardmen in line by claiming it spreads to them too. Owen, sweating, asks if that lie would actually put his own people in danger. Owen points out some plants that ooze sticky sap and suggests they can pass it off as the deadly slime. Since he knows many frogmen, he offers to fake being the first victim himself, and Shunin lights up, calling the plan brilliant. Shunin says that if Owen can lure the black scale warriors into the village, he will leave Owen's son out of the sacrifice list. The lizardman bows over and over, flooding him with thanks, clinging to that promise. As they walk along the lakeshore, Shunin cheerfully admits they will need quite a few offerings this time and says he will try to win Aboy over. Owen hurries after him, calling out before the frogman heir can leave. Owen admits it is a bold favor but says that, for the talks with the black scales, it would help a lot if they could bring some bows along. Shunin studies him with a sharp look, already guessing those weapons are meant for more than simple trade. Soon the clearing fills with crates, sacks, and armed bodies as frogmen and black scale lizardmen mix together, busy with trade and talk. Most of them treat it like a normal market day, not knowing some of them have been marked as offerings. Frogman proudly shows off a thick strip of hide, urging the lizardman to feel how it barely bends under his fists. The craftsman admits the stuff is amazing, but grumbles that he has no idea how to shape something that hard into gear. Nearby, bundles of dried plants are stacked neatly, and someone explains that this herb works well on itching, the same symptom everyone now fears. To Owen, it is both medicine and the perfect prop for the lie he plans to spread. The Black Scale Chief eyes the stacked bundles and grumbles that even gathering every herb they could find still might not be enough to get a few bows. Shunin taps his chin and calmly tells him the problem is not that their offer is too small. The frogman heir explains that handing over weapons is tricky and says he needs some clear proof of trust before he can agree. The Black Scale Chief props his chin on his fist, silently cursing how every talk with Shunin turns into another demand for faith. His eyes narrow as he weighs his options, already planning a different way to push this deal through. Soon after, the Black Scale Chief stands before Shunin's stone seat, and in front of both tribes, frames his next move as a single favor for the sake of their friendship. The chief points past Shunin and asks for one thing only, a private talk with Owen, the lizardman standing among the frogmen. Shunin trades a sly look with his fellow frogmen, already turning that simple request into a chance to tighten his grip on both sides. The gray-skinned lizardman closed his eyes and gave a small, calm nod, agreeing to go along with the request. The Black-Scaled Chief led the way into the quiet forest while Owen followed a few steps behind, the noise of both tribes fading with every step. Their heavy feet sank into the grass in almost the same rhythm as Owen calmly brought up how his people once sealed a brotherly bond with the frogmen. The gray-skinned lizardman said they had time before any ritual and suggested they trade stories, promising to share everything he knew about the frogmen if the chief spoke about his own tribe. With his arms spread, Owen urged them to put aside doubt and move forward one careful step at a time. And right then, a blue butterfly of the god drifted between them like a quiet sign of approval. The bright blue butterfly rose into the sky, leaving a trail of tiny lights as if it were gently showing them where this new bond could lead. The glowing butterfly settled on Owen's head, making him grin before drifting down between them again, and the Black-Scaled Chief frowned slightly, surprised that such a creature was even here and feeling that this meeting might be guided by more than luck.